"I'll be back in 20 minutes, dear," said Peter Reynolds to his wife Maggie as he put on his coat and stepped out of his beige ranch home for his evening walk. He walked down Memorial Drive, past the model homes of his neighbors, and stopped in front of Murphy's Delicatessen, a big grin on his face. "Good evening, Shirley," he said as he approached the thin brunette standing outside. "Hi, Peter," said Shirley. She was tall and graceful, with a flattering waistline and an ass to match. She was dressed in a smart white blouse and a pair of tight-fitting Gloria Vanderbilt jeans with a little swan on the back pocket. The pair walked the neighborhood together, mocking their spouses, discussing the previous night's episode of All in the Family, laughing, flirting. From the kitchen window of that beige ranch up the hill, Maggie Reynolds watched her husband as she scrubbed dried-up potatoes off his dinner plate. "That's the third night this week that I've seen him with that shrew," thought Maggie. "It can't be a coincidence. I'm no fool." A few houses down, looking out the front window of his baby blue ranch, was Shirley's husband, Ted. "What's that son of a bitch think he's doing?" he thought as he cleaned the barrel of his pistol with a soft yellow cloth. Later that night, Peter and Shirley caught hell from their spouses. Accusations were made, fingers pointed. Someone's face may have been slapped. "Why are you always walking with that guy? Are you and Shirley Elliott best buddies now, huh? I don't want to see you with that asshole. You got it? What's she got that I don't have?" The jig was up. It was obvious to anybody with a pulse that Peter and Shirley weren't meeting up every night by accident, and Shirley had a black eye to prove it. The secret lovers decided they would have to meet in a more secluded place from that point on. Valleyview Cemetery seemed like an odd choice at first. Mausoleums and the constant specter of death aren't necessarily the keys to a romantic evening, but it was private. A few nights later, Shirley was standing next to a grave with the name Wintermute carved into it when Peter came walking down the cemetery path. "I was worried you wouldn't show," said Peter, grinning. "Thought you'd be too creeped out." Shirley laughed. "Hey, I'll put up with ghosts and zombies if it keeps me away from Ted for an hour." Peter held out his hand and Shirley took hold of it. Firmly. Absolutely. They walked for a while before kissing against a mausoleum like foolhardy teenagers. Ted grabbed Shirley and pulled her in close. As they made out, they crossed a barrier they hadn't dared cross before. They explored new avenues of their relationship as they moved from grave to grave, tumbling and caressing on hollowed ground. To say that Maggie gave Peter shit for coming home 2 hours after leaving for a leisurely evening walk would be a massive understatement. She berated him, called him a good-for-nothing, said he would never measure up as a father. She might as well have cut off his balls and mailed them to Siberia. Peter spent the night in his car. The next morning, he woke up with a sore neck and the stark realization that things couldn't go on this way. He was in too deep with Maggie. They had co-signed a loan for their house just 9 months prior. It had to stop. A couple days later, after things had cooled down, Peter walked into Valleyview to break it off with Shirley. Though only nights had passed since they had last seen each other, the cemetery seemed as if it had grown darker, the graves crowded closer together. He didn't recall feeling this uneasy the first time they had met there, but now the place gave him the creeps. Shirley stood at Mr. Wintermute's grave, a broken look on her face. She gave Peter a little half-smile as he approached. "Hi, Peter." "Hi, Shirley." Peter bit his lip and shuffled his feet on the gravel pathway. "We need to talk." Shirley's eyes opened wide and the moon reflected off her pupils, making them look like shimmering pools. "Peter, I know this seems crazy, but I think we could make this work. If we just don't." He cut her off before she could change his mind, and with eyes like those it wouldn't take much, he thought. This can't go on any longer. They know, all right. We knew this would never work. There was the sound of footsteps rapidly approaching, and Peter felt someone suddenly grab him by the neck. Before he had time to react or see who had attacked him, he was thrown to the ground next to a cold, hard tombstone. A few inches closer, and he would have had an instant lobotomy. He looked up to see his neighbor, Ted Elliott, standing over him with a frenzied look in his eyes. Ted was an ass, but the worst Peter had ever seen him was the day he had run over a tree stump and broke the new lawnmower. He thought Ted was angry that day. Ted picked him up by the shirt collar and was about to throw him back down again, but Peter swept his leg and the two of them fell to the ground. They rolled around, trading punches, socks to the head and gut. Peter found himself on top of Ted and brought down both of his fists on his chest like he was a choking victim. Ted let out a harsh wheeze as Peter's balled-up fist connected with his body. Peter was about to bring his fist down for another round when a large rock struck his skull, unleashing a flurry of blood and sending him thumping to the ground. Ted looked over to see his wife, Shirley, holding the blood-soaked rock in her trembling hands. She dropped to her knees and started wailing. "What have I done?" she screamed, her cries echoing throughout the cemetery. Ted walked over to her and stared, mouth agape. "I had to do it, Ted. He was going to kill you." She was delirious. I know it was wrong of me. It was just a fling, you hear? He didn't mean anything. It was just a fling. This little voice in my head said I had to help you, Ted. Then it was just screaming at me. I can't explain it. And when I saw him coming down on you like that, I just couldn't take it. I love you, Ted." Ted pressed the palm of his hand firmly over her mouth. "Shut up! Just shut up right now! Do you realize what you've done?" He looked down at Peter, who lay on the ground motionless. "You killed the good-for-nothing bastard." Without saying another word, he walked away. Shirley sat on the grass, her eyes frozen, staring at the body of her lover. Ted returned a minute later, holding a shovel he lifted from the caretaker's shed. He walked to an overgrown, seemingly neglected corner of the cemetery and started digging. When he was done, he walked back toward where Shirley knelt in the grass, crying silently, his clothes covered in dirt and blood, his and Peter's. "Help me carry him," said Ted. He looked at her as if he would snap her neck if she didn't comply. They each picked up one side of Peter's body, Ted the legs, Shirley the head, though she strained to hold her end, and carried him over to the freshly dug hole. They dropped his body into the shallow grave, and Ted picked the shovel back up like he was doing any other routine job in the back garden. He started to dump the dirt over Peter when Shirley jumped in and started weeping on Peter's chest. "Don't!" yelled Shirley. "Ted, what are we doing? This is Peter Reynolds. You used to be in the same bowling league. He helped us clean up when the basement flooded last spring. I know what I did was wrong. Something hideous just took a hold of me. I'll make it up to you and the Lord, but please, we can't do this. We have to turn ourselves in. I mean, is he even dead? How do we know for sure?" She put her head to Peter's chest. Ted held the shovel in his hands, gripping the handle tighter and tighter. The more Shirley cried, and the more he thought of her screwing Peter, the more he wanted to act. Suddenly, he felt the shovel torn from his hands, and he turned to see Maggie Reynolds holding it. He hadn't ever seen her hold anything heavier than a tray full of finger foods. Shirley stood, facing her husband and former lover's wife, resigned to their final judgment. "Oh, shut your trap, you cheating whore," said Maggie as she whacked Shirley in the face with the shovel. Blood gushed from her open wound as she fell over, landing on top of her former lover. Shirley lay in the shallow grave, seemingly as motionless as Peter. Ted looked at Maggie. Without saying a word, she handed the shovel back to him, and he threw dirt over the unmarked burial of Peter Reynolds and Shirley Elliott. Ted and Maggie had both noticed a slight shifting in the dirt as it accumulated, but neither spoke of it that night or any time after. It wasn't long before the whole neighborhood found out. Peter and Shirley had been having an affair and they'd run off together. Ted Elliott and Maggie Reynolds were often seen walking the neighborhood. Most folks assumed they were just helping each other cope with the betrayal of their spouses. They always avoided Valleyview Cemetery, though. And who could blame them? What would make good people want to walk through a foul place like that?